This is the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And Halenda's, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortinos, and Foodland locations. Halenda's, the way sausage should taste. And now, here's Ted.
Well, hi there, and welcome to another edition of the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Glad you are here. Appreciate you being with us. If you're new to the program, welcome aboard. And if you've been with us before, thanks for being with us again. Don't forget to follow us, and that means that every week we'll kind of just pop up automatically, and you don't have to go searching for us. And we release a new podcast, a new episode each Thursday morning. So again, thanks very much for being with us. We hope you enjoy what you're about to hear. I think you will. My very special guest this week is a journalist. He's an award-winning documentarian, and he's the anchor of TVO's flagship current affairs program, The Agenda with Steve Paikin, which airs weeknights at 8 p.m. He's also authored 8 books, his latest titled John Turner, an intimate biography of Canada's 17th Prime Minister. Welcome, Steve Paikin. So congratulations to you, Steve. 30 years at TVO and a brand new book, which is doing extremely well. I'm very happy for you. And thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be with you. Thank you, Ted. Great to see you again.
I want to talk about your book, which was written about John Turner. But before we get into that, I want to talk about Steve Paikin because people have seen you for so many years, but maybe you might not know as much about you as they would like to know about you. You're a Hamilton boy, right?
Indeed.
Cat fan.
Indeed. Not a great year this past year, but
no.
Almost won a Grey Cup last year.
Yes, that's true. That's true. I'm an Argo fan. That's why I brought it up.
Nobody's perfect, Ted. That's okay.
No, I know that's true. Listen. As an Argo fan, we've had our years as well, and you're a big Boston Red Sox fan as well.
Now, I always hasten to add, I became a Red Sox fan before the Blue Jays were born. So I like the Blue Jays, but I have stuck with my original love.
I have a good friend who's a huge Detroit Tigers fan because he grew up in Windsor and he was around before the Jays were around. And when you have this passion for a team when you're growing up, it's hard to just push it aside because you've got a new team in your backyard, right?
And it's been a good century for the Red Sox, Ted. 4 World Series,
yeah.
Hey,
listen.
Waited a long time for them, and it was worth the wait.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a formidable team, and it's not a team that Blue Jay fans or the Blue Jays can ever take lightly. We know that. We've seen that way too many times. Your first job was in Hamilton at the Spectator, correct?
That was a part-time job. I had the distinction,
if
you could call it that, of being, I think, the only summertime fill-in replacement reporter at the Hamilton Spectator who did 3 consecutive summers without being offered a full-time job at the end of it. Oftentimes, the real guys would go on vacation in the summer, and they'd get a bunch of us out of school to fill in for them. Usually, 1 summer or 2 summers, and very often they would be offered full-time jobs at the end of it. Because, of course, newspaper back then it was a growing business, and money was being made, and so on. But I did 3 summers there, and they never offered me a full-time job at the end of it. They said, thanks, it's been fun, but that's it. I guess they knew I was not meant to be a newspaper man.
Were you paid because it was an intern job, right?
It was there was
an actual job.
Absolutely, yeah. We were summer fill-in. I think it lasted 2 months or so. It was all of July and August, and it was a great way to learn about a city that I had lived in all my life, and yet, of course, didn't know nearly as well as I should have, because when you report from a city, you just learn so much more about it, as you know.
Right. Now, this all stemmed back from when you were growing up. Is it true that your mother used to read the newspaper to you over breakfast, specifically the sports section? Is that right?
To my brother and me, yes. We were inculcated in usually Dick. Now, here's a name from the past, but Dick Beddoes was a Globe and Mail columnist, and she used to love reading Dick Beddoes' columns to us because he was always so full of piss and vinegar.
Yeah.
But she'd read we went to a lot of Leaf games as kids because my parents always wanted to know that we were not on the street getting into trouble on a Saturday night. So they drove us in from Hamilton to Toronto. We all went to the Leaf games together. And, the Globe didn't publish, as it still does not, on Sunday. So Monday mornings over breakfast, she'd read us the game account. And yeah, that's one way we got into it for sure.
And that was the thing that got you interested to the point where you thought, well, maybe I should consider this as a career, or was it one of those deals where I don't know what I want to do, and this kind of came along?
I think the seed was probably planted and I didn't even know it, because
Hmm.
the moment when I realized that I wanted to do what you and I ended up doing, getting in front of microphones and talking and learning and talking to other people, was my first year at University of Toronto, which would be 1978. I went to Hart House even before school started. So we're talking, I guess, last week of August in 1978. And you walk into Hart House, which is this gorgeous old Gothic
Yeah,
building in the
sure.
downtown campus at U of T. And I see, there's a table for the debate club and the geography club and the archery club and the photography club. And Ted, there was a table there that said, with a sign on it, U of T radio.
Hmm.
And I don't know what happened at that moment, but it was a eureka moment. And I walked over to them, and that's what started it all.
And you did play by play for the Varsity Blues hockey and football teams, right?
That's exactly right. I walked up to the guy behind the table. His name was Steve Kerr. And I said, "Do you have anybody who does the play by play for the Blues, hockey, or football?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Can I do it?" He said, "Sure." That was it. And I said, "You mean," and again, here's another name that many of your younger listeners will not know, but I said, "You mean I could be the Foster Hewitt of the University of Toronto?" Evoking the first ever play by play voice of the Maple Leafs.
Yeah,
And he said, "Yeah, sure." And so I started with that. And my color commentator was a guy, I'm sure, Michael Landsberg. We did the
sure.
games together. And then we ended up working together at CHFI and CFTR. And then he spent 30 years at TSN with a fantastic career with a show called Off the Record. And
Hmm.
somehow we managed to get careers out of this.
Yeah, and your first foray into television was at what used to be referred to as CBLT, which is CBC Toronto.
That's exactly right. My first job was at CHFI and CFTR, City Hall reporter from
And
1982 to 85. And then I left that very enjoyable permanent job on a 5-month contract. Uh, if I suppose if it turned out well, I could be renewed, which it turns out I was. But if it didn't work out, I'd just given up a full-time job for a very part-time opportunity, which would have been considered a pretty dumb move. But it worked out okay, and I was a local news reporter for, as it was then called, CBLT, Channel 5, Cable 6 in Toronto. Hillary Brown was the anchor. I'm still in
sure.
touch with her all these years later. She's a great, great woman. And there we go, and another rung on the ladder.
Was Fraser Kelly there when you were there?
He was, yes. The two of them did the news together, and then Fraser left, set up his own company. Fraser just died not too long ago,
Yeah, he did.
and I had the great honor of doing a little eulogy at his memorial service, and he was a great mentor to me. I wanted to be him. It is not an exaggeration to say that I wanted to be him. He was an anchor who did conventions and elections, and he knew people and was a great broadcaster, and that's what I wanted to be. And I'm delighted that he was such a good teacher to me over
Hmm.
the years.
And Brian Williams would have been doing sports at that time, I guess.
Brian, I think, had just left. I
Oh,
think
just
when
left.
I was
Okay.
there, yeah, Brian was at the network by the time I got there. But Brian, of course, was also an inspiration to me because he was a Hamilton boy, went to the same high school as my dad, Westdale Collegiate, and I very well remember meeting Brian as a teenager at a sports banquet. And there was another guy I looked at and said, "Well, I guess if I can't be Fraser Kelly, I'd sure love to be Brian Williams."
Yeah. So you're at Queens Park, working for you're the Queens Park correspondent for CBLT. Is that when you fell in love with politics and politicians? Because you've written what six books in total in your career as an author, I believe.
I think the John Turner book's number 8.
Number
But
8, okay. Because
yeah.
if you go online and try to figure it out, I've gotten anything from 4 to 6, and I think all of them have been about politics, except for one, which was about the NHL.
Yeah, and there's another one in there as well. I wrote about a friend of mine's dad who was a Holocaust survivor. He survived
Okay,
Auschwitz, and I did a book on him. But yeah,
okay,
in the main, I think 6 of the 8 books have been about politics. And where I actually started to fall for politics was well before that. We talked about this part-time summer job I had at the Hamilton Spectator when I was a teenager, and I went to them and I said, I'm the voice of the Varsity Blues at the University of Toronto, and I do sportscasting, and I just want to cover sports. So if you guys need a sports guy to cover anything you want, Ticats, single A baseball, Hamilton Cardinals, I'm your guy.
Mm-hmm.
And the editor at the time, a guy named Rob Austin, no longer with us, Rob Austin said to me, you're 19 years old. You are far too young to specialize in sports. So we're going to take you on and we're going to make you cover everything but sports. And that was when, I did school board, I did crime, I did city hall, I did, that's where I started to really have my eyes open to other things. And it all thanks to Rob Austin, who I was mad at because he wouldn't let me cover sports, but it turned out to be just the right move.
I remember having a prof when I went to Seneca College who was talking to some of the students one day, and a couple of them said, "Well, I'm just getting into radio because I love music. I just want to play music." And the prof looked at him and he said, "That's great." He says, "But trust me, you better be able to do more than just spin records."
That is so true. And I'll tell you, Ted, the best advice I ever got in my career was from a guy named, we're really going down memory lane here, David Claytell, who was the dean of the journalism school at Boston University, where I went because I was a Red Sox fan. It's right beside Fenway Park. And I asked David Claytell on my first day, what's the most important thing I need to ultimately getting a full-time job? And he said, flexibility. Tell them you can do anything. And of course, by the time I was finished my degree at BU, I could make that legitimate claim because they had you do everything. News, sports, weather, field reporting, anchoring, long-form journalism, short-form journalism. And so his words were very prescient. So by the time it came time to looking for that job, I could get one. Took a year, but I eventually got one.
So how did the opportunity at TVO present itself to you?
The man who hired me at CBLT for that 5-month contract, which turned into a 9-month contract, which turned into a 1-year contract, and eventually, having spent 7 years at CBLT, his name was Howard Bernstein. He was the executive producer of the 6 o'clock news, and he had left, and he went to TVO, hired by Peter Herndorf, who was the chair and CEO of TVO, having left CBC as a vice president of news and current affairs there. And ostensibly, Howard's job was to create a new Queen's Park show, continue a weekly town hall show, with a view someday down the road to creating a new daily show at TVO. TVO didn't do any daily current affairs at that point. So that was his mission. So he called me and he said, we're going to try and start something new here. We think you're the guy for it. Come on in, talk to Peter, see what you think. And I had one meeting with Peter Herndorf and I was sold. I just thought, this is what I want to do. And we all worked on a show called Between the Lines, which was this weekly town hall show. Fourth Reading was the name of the Queen's Park show that we started. Every bill before it becomes law needs first, second, and third reading. So we were going to be fourth reading, give it that once over. If it was a football show, we'd have called it the fifth quarter, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And we did that for a bunch of time. And then we started that new daily show called Studio 2 a couple of years later. And holy smokes, now it's 30 years later. I've done 5 different shows there, and I can scarcely believe I've been there that long.
Steve Paikin is my guest. He's the host of The Agenda, which airs on TVO weeknights at 8 p.m. TVO was started by a man who became a friend of yours, Bill Davis, when he was premier, correct?
He actually started it when he was Minister of Education in John Robarts' government. But yes, I consider it one of the great honors of my life to have not only covered his fourth and final government in the early 1980s, but then after he left public life in 1985, I kind of pestered him for about 30 years to cooperate with me on my writing a book about his life. And I remember my wife calling him one time. He's about 85 years old. And she calls him and she says, Mr. Davis, my husband's not getting any younger. You really should say yes at some point. And eventually he did. And it was really, Ted, it was a joyous experience. I spent time with him. He's in his late 80s at this point. I spent time with him in Brampton at his home, at his cottage on Georgian Bay, at his condo in Florida, at his law offices in Brampton. We talked about things, I can confidently say this. He talked about things with me that he'd never talked about, never mind with other journalists before, but I would even go so far as to say that he hadn't even discussed with other family members before because he was such a modest private guy. And And I guess he was at a point in his life where he felt he could open up. And thankfully, I was the guy he picked to open up to. So I wrote a 600-page book on him that came out, I guess, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago.
With a great title called Bill Davis, Nation Builder, and Not So Bland After All.
Yeah.
Your idea for the title?
Let me think for a second. Patrick Boyer, who was a former Conservative MP, went into book publishing. He and I actually, we bumped into each other at something, and we sat down and I said, I need a good title for this book. And the two of us just started to sort of throw ideas out there, and we came up with it together. And the part, like Nation Builder is obvious. He was one of the guys who was singularly responsible for working with the current Prime Minister's father to repatriate the Constitution with an amending, with a Charter of Rights and Freedoms attached, 1981-82. So that's the Nation Builder part. The Not So Bland After All refers to a comment he made when he was Premier. Hugh Windsor, then a reporter for the Globe and Mail, asked Mr. Davis, why do you run such a boring, bland government? And Mr. Davis's two-word answer, a classic, was bland works.
Yeah.
And he was, I think, for him, and you might even say at some points in his career for Doug Ford as well, bland works is not a bad operating theory. And Mr. Davis always believed it was not his responsibility to entertain journalists at Queen's Park. He felt it was his responsibility to provide a decent, moderate, pragmatic, forward-looking government, which I guess he did pretty well because he got reelected 3 times. He's, I think, the first premier in 100 years to have won 4 straight elections. So he obviously had something going for him. And that's why we put Not So Bland After All, because he actually did a lot of big things that were very dramatic and dynamic and not bland at all.
But he was actually a very entertaining speaker, though. I mean, I probably saw him speak a dozen different times after he had left public office, and he was a terrific speaker. I mean, he's very low key, not animated, but very entertaining.
Ted, there was a moment after. Remember, he takes over from John Robarts in 1971. He inherits a majority government, then wins a bigger majority government. So he's really the king of Queen's Park. He's only 41 years old at the time. But his first government was not good. Lots of scandals, lots of problems, not so much ethically related to him, but some of his ministers. And 4 years later, he survives by the skin of his teeth and wins a minority government. First minority the Tories had since the 40s, okay? But it's like a near-death political experience. Something happened to him after the disaster that was his first 4 years and still managing to save the silverware. And he just became calmer, funnier, a lot more relaxed, and he turned from this sort of technocratic, a little bit tight-assed, if I can put it that way, Premier of Ontario, to Johnny Carson. Yeah. And he became that speaker that you just referred to. He could get up there on the stump and he could pick people out of the room and tease them and make fun of them. And just, he made people feel good. And that was the secret to his success. And he ended up serving 14 years as premier.
Whenever I saw him speak at functions where Hazel McCallion, then the mayor of Mississauga, was present, he would always make sure that he pointed out that she was there in attendance and that he had saved her career, because she had railed against him because he wanted to amalgamate what were 7 different parts of Mississauga, including Streetsville and Mississauga itself, Clarkson, etc., into this one big city, Mississauga, and Hazel was dead set against it. And so by doing that, he then elevated her to the great level that she remains at to this day, even in retirement.
If he did that once, he did it 100 times, where he'd see her in the audience, spot her, and said, I made your career, Hazel. You railed against me, you fought against me, but I guess I was right in the end, and you're the longest serving mayor in Canadian history as a result.
Yeah, Steve Paikin is my guest. Another one of your books, Paikin and the Premiers, where you talk about your interviews with John Robarts, Bill Davis, Frank Miller. No, there was Bland. David Peterson, Bob Ray, Mike Harris, Ernie Eves, Dalton McGuinty, Kathleen Wynne, and Doug Ford. Of all those people that you interviewed, without being rude to any of them, had you missed any of them, if for whatever reason you couldn't have had an opportunity to speak to them, would you have been sad?
Well, yeah, the answer is yes. And you're actually giving me an opportunity to get up on a soapbox here and say that TVO, and thankfully the shows that I've been associated with at TVO, have interviewed every premier of Ontario
Yeah.
since John Robarts, who was the premier, of course, when TVO was created. But not Doug Ford. We've had every premier
You
of
haven't,
Ontario,
right?
from Robarts to Wynne, on our various programs over the years, but not Doug Ford. Now, Doug Ford, in fairness, was in for a mayoralty debate when he ran against John Tory. He did come in then. He did come in for a book interview because he and his brother co-authored a book. But again, that's before he was premier. In the last 4.5 years that he's been the premier of Ontario, I don't know whether it's he or his staff. Whenever we ask, it's always the premier is unavailable. And the premier has given myriad one-on-one interviews since he became the premier of Ontario, but not to the station he owns as a trustee for the people of Ontario. And I don't mind saying I don't get it, because every time he's been on in the past, again, since in times before he was premier, he's always said to me he enjoyed the experience and that he gets great feedback. So I don't know why he or his staff won't let him do it, but I think it's a shame because I think our viewers deserve to hear from him. But
I can understand why some politicians shy away from some journalists because they know that those journalists are after them. You're a fair guy. I mean, you're not afraid to ask the tough questions, but you don't go after them. You're not a pit bull. And I think that you would be more than fair to him, and probably fairer than a lot of journalists have been on one-on-one whenever they're allowed to ask a question, whenever they're not applauded away by his minions who are standing around. And it's surprising to me that he wouldn't do that, especially right now. I mean, he's sitting out with the majority government. What has he got to lose?
I don't know. It makes no sense at all to me. We personally have a good relationship. Every time I, bump into him in the community or something, it's always very warm. You're I remember now, actually, the inscription, because I had him sign my book after we did the book interview, and I remember the inscription that he put in my book, which was, to Steve, who always gives a fair interview, and he signed it. So I just don't get it. I don't get it at all.
Ted Woloshyn returns in a moment.
Our Boxing Day sale is here, and it suits us perfectly. Hey, it's Ted Woloshyn for Tom's Place, and we love offering incredible deals during December and into Boxing Week. We're open for business and, more importantly, on sale each and every day except New Year's Day. Check out our website, toms-place.com, for details about our specials and ours. We have no supply chain issues. We are fully stocked. In fact, we have huge amounts of inventory that we want to move, and the deals are simply amazing. Prices lower than ever in the 60-plus history of Tom's Place. Shirts, sweaters, coats, sports jackets, suits, and more, priced to be given away to you. And we've got gift certificates as well. Tom's Place Boxing Week sales on now, Kensington Market. So now, more than ever, it's important to shop local. Thank you for your support. Tom's Place, the Boxing Week sale, will suit you. Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor, or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1-866-309-0387. That's 1-866-309-0387. Or you can get her at info@etpcanada.ca. That's info@etpcanada.ca.
Now back to Ted Woloshyn.
When you're interviewing the premiers, and they know that you've spoken to their predecessors, going all the way back to John Robarts, how important is their history to them? Not their own history, but how important is it, for example, would it have been for Kathleen Wynne looking back in the history of her predecessors and what they accomplished in terms of how she wanted to move forward? Do they care about what happened before?
Definitely. I think you've touched on something really important here, which is they do see themselves, at least, I can't speak for the current premier because I haven't had a chance to ask him this, but I would say that I have asked this question of all of his predecessors, and they do care about their place in history. That's why they want the job in the first place. They do care about the contribution that they make to the province and how it will be remembered. And you know, I remember Bill Davis and Kathleen Wynne had a great relationship. It was very amusing. She used to call him for advice, particularly on things like post-secondary issues, because he was a very fine colleges and universities minister before he was premier. And they used to kind of joke with each other about who was a better minister of education. Bill Davis, who created the college system, who created OISE, who created TVO, Kathleen Wynne, who was the minister of education when there was labor peace all over the province of Ontario. There were no elementary or secondary school teacher strikes when she was a minister of education, and they made some advances in a wide variety of areas. The two of them used to joke with each other about who was the best education minister in Ontario history. I won't weigh in there other than to say I think WGD has a bit more of a claim on it, but there you go.
I think so.
I think very much they care about this, and Bill Davis used to say to Kathleen Wynne, remember, here are two people, different parties, relatively different places on the political spectrum. I think Kathleen Wynne was a lot more small L liberal than Mr. Davis was, obviously, but they liked each other a lot, and they had a very good rapport. And Mr. Davis used to say, "I like her. I'll do whatever I can to support her until 6 months before the next election, and then I'm campaigning for her opponent."
Right.
And neither one of them was under any illusions, but that was the way it had to be. Because Mr. Davis was a true blue Tory, of course.
Of course. So as you look back, and even during those times when you were interviewing those politicians, did you sense any type of shift in attitudes of politicians toward each other? Because it seems to me, and I've talked to a number of former politicians who have agreed with me in my assessment that the game of politics is a lot uglier and a lot more disrespectful now than it was 30, 40 years ago.
I definitely agree with that. And the other dirty little secret, if I can put it this way, Ted, is that, interestingly enough, the people who are the premiers of different parties actually get along with each other a lot better than you'd think.
Yeah.
And the premiers of the same parties don't get along as well as you might think. And I don't know how specific we want to be about this. I mean, there've only been 9 premiers in the last 50 years, so you can kind of figure it out yourself.
Yeah.
The big exception would be Robarts and Davis. I don't think there's any doubt that Mr. Robarts hoped and knew Bill Davis would succeed him. And even though he didn't vote for Mr. Davis on the first ballot, I know that for a fact. But Mr. Davis held Mr. Robarts in the highest of regard and esteem, so they had a very good relationship. But others along the way, not so much. It's interesting, Ted, Bob Rae got a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association of Former Parliamentarians at Queen's Park a few weeks back. And he told a story about how when Ernie Eves, who you remember, took over for Mike Harris,
right,
but was actually in the private sector when Mr. Harris resigned. And Ernie Eves, Conservative Premier, called Bob Rae, former New Democrat Premier, for advice on whether, I just got into the private sector. Should I leave and get back into public life that I've just left, or should I stay where I am? And you might not think that a conservative like Ernie Eves would call a former NDP or like Bob Rae to ask advice, but there you go, he did.
I haven't had the opportunity to meet the kinds of people that you have in your life, but I will share one interesting story with Hazel McCallion, who was my mayor. For her 90th birthday, they had a huge function, and I was honored to act as MC along with John Tory. And sitting at our table it was me, John Tory, Bob Rae, and John Turner.
Good table.
Yeah, and Mike Harris. And I thought, well, this is a really interesting mix of people. How's this going to go down? And they were all cool with each other. I mean, and it was surprising to me to see how warm and how comfortable Bob Rae was with Mike Harris. And I guess it's because they were both out of that picture already and didn't have to worry about that. The body checking had stopped because they had left the arena.
Well, the other thing you've got to remember is, Ontario is whatever we are now, 155 years old, 155 and a half years old. We've had 20 6 premiers. It's a pretty exclusive club.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you're lucky enough to have been in that club, when you see a fellow member of the club in a social setting as you did, they know how to behave properly. I remember we had one of the first shows I did on the agenda. We're going back to October of 2006 here. One of the first shows I did is I managed to convince every living ex-premier to come in and do a show on being premier, what it's like to have that job. And unfortunately, Mr. Davis got sick the day before, so he wasn't there. But Mr. Reeves was there, Mr. Harris, Mr. Peterson, Mr. Ray. They were all there. And I remember some of the people at TVO that I was working with saying, now, we know Harris and Eves don't get along that well anymore, so do we have to put them in separate waiting rooms? And we know that Ray and Peterson don't get along all that well. Should we put them in separate waiting rooms? And they were really spending a lot of time worrying about this. And finally I said, guys, they're all pros.
Yeah.
They're all, they all are members of the same exclusive club. This is going to be fine. Stop sweating this. And of course, we put them all in the same green room. And of course, they all got on famously. And of course, they all went out there on the set and did a great show.
It reminds me of at President Bush's funeral, where all the former presidents and their wives were seated in the front row. And it was at that point I realized and learned that George W. Bush and Michelle Obama had become really close friends and had this sense of humor that they shared. And I would have never have put the two of them together on the same page at all. And then there's a story that circulates, and you tell me if this is true or not, but at Trump's inauguration, when Trump got up to speak,
I know the story you're going to tell.
Bush is sitting next to Michelle Obama, and he says something. I think it was Michelle Obama, maybe it's Hillary, and Trump says something, and Bush looks and says, "Man, that's some really weird shit."
Exactly right. I've heard the same story. Trump finished his speech, and George W. Bush, who was a very plain-spoken guy, looked over. I think it was Hillary. I think it was Hillary Clinton, said, "Man, that was some weird shit."
But you could see at the funeral, you could see the camaraderie, and you're right. They all held that same office, man. They had things in common with each other that they didn't have with any of their other friends.
Ted, there are, as I say, 26 people in the history of this province who know what it's like to have that job and know what it's like who understand the pressures of that job, the 24/7 pressures, the being responsible for the welfare of what we now have, 15, 16 million people, who are ultimately responsible for where we're at right now, $200 billion in expenditures. They're the last line of defense. I remember Dalton McGuinty telling me once that, if an issue is easy to solve, it doesn't get to his desk. By the time an issue gets to his desk, the preponderance of evidence is like 51% one way, 49% the other way, right? It's not black or white. You're always dealing with shades of gray because the issues are complicated. And you'll agonize and you'll seek advice and you'll think about it, and then you'll make a decision. And then who knows, 2 weeks later, the facts change and it might be 51-49 the other way now, and you've made your decision. So we have to remember, gosh, who was it? Charles Beer. Charles Beer, who was a former aide to John Robarts, we're going back to the 1960s now, has a moment where Leslie Frost, the previous premier, has got his arms around John Robarts, the current premier, and Charles Beer is witnessing this as a 20-something kid who's an assistant. And Frost says to Robarts, "It never lets up, does it, John? It never lets up." And that's exactly the point. You're never really off the clock when you're the Premier of Ontario. It's in my view, the second hardest job in the country behind being Prime Minister. And very few people have had it. So of course, they have this thing in common that will bind them together forever.
Steve Paikin is my guest. He, of course, is the host of TVO's Agenda. He's also the author of 8 books, as we've now learned. His most recent that was just released, I guess, a couple of months ago, called John Turner, An Intimate Biography of Canada's 17th Prime Minister. And when you think of that, you think, yeah, right, he was Prime Minister. But he was only Prime Minister for 79 days.
Yes, he was. And,
who did he beat out? Kim Campbell?
Well, no. He took over from...
In terms of longevity.
Oh, in terms of longevity. No, Charles Tupper. You got to go back to the 19th century.
Oh, yeah.
Only Charles
Okay.
Tupper had less time than Mr. Turner in the Prime Minister's office. And of course, he had such a short time because remember, these are the days before the fixed election date. So it's
Yeah.
up to the Prime Minister when to have the election.
Right.
And the most important decision that the Prime Minister makes, back then anyway, is the timing of that election. And he guessed wrong. He guessed badly wrong. He won the leadership in June of '84, and he decided to call a snap election. And he wasn't ready. His party wasn't ready. He went up against Brian Mulroney, who was ready.
Yep.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
And what inspired you to write this biography of Mr. Turner? You were friends of his.
We became friendly after his public
After,
life was
right?
over. Yeah, that's true. Our birthdays were 2 days apart, and we used to go out for lunch on our birthdays every year together. And we'd see each other at various events during the course of the year. I just quite liked him. He was a great raconteur, great storyteller. But the fact of the matter is, Ted, I really didn't want to write the book. I just finished, as I told you earlier, 600 pages on Bill Davis a few years earlier, and I was kind of spent.
Yeah.
I wasn't really looking for another book to write. But a couple of Mr. Turner's colleagues approached me the month after he died. He died in September 2020. So they approached me a month later and they said, you knew him, you were friends with him. You could bring something different to a new biography on him. There had been biographies written, but nothing in say 10 years. And they said, beyond that, no one's ever talked to his family. And we think you could talk to his family. And no one's got access to his very most personal papers, which are in the archives in Canada and won't become available without family permission for another 30 years. And they said, we think you could probably get access to that too. And the more I thought about it, I thought, well, maybe I can bring something different to a different take on this guy. It's easy to sum up his life as 79 days of prime minister, and that's all he did. And that would be so unfair because he
Yeah.
was so
Yes, it
much
would.
more than that.
Yes, it would. Especially about a guy who claims that one of the greatest things that he did outside the political arena, and that was to lead a delegation of 500 Canadians to Ukraine to oversee the Ukrainian presidential elections. And he said, quote, "It was the best thing I ever did." Why?
Isn't that interesting, eh? Can you imagine a guy who was Prime Minister of Canada, who
Yeah,
was Minister of Justice and Minister of Finance in Pierre Trudeau's cabinet, despite all of those great titles, he said, the best thing I ever did was lead a 500-person strong delegation of Canadians to go over to Ukraine for a week in the week of Christmas 2004 and make sure that relatively new democracy held free and fair presidential elections. He cared a lot about Ukraine for a couple of reasons. Number one, a guy named Jim Temerty was
yeah,
a big friend of his.
sure.
Temerty, originally from Ukraine, became an incredibly successful Canadian businessman over here, and he and Mr. Turner were friends. And there was a significant Ukrainian community that Mr. Turner would obviously have been aware of as Prime Minister. I think we have one of the largest diaspora communities, maybe actually the largest gathering of Ukrainians outside Ukraine in the whole
That's
world
right.
living
It
in
is.
Canada.
Yep, it is.
And he was, of course, as a politician, very plugged into that. So, and he loved democracy. Ted, it became the mission of his later years. He would go into schools in his 60s, 70s, and 80s, and preach, the good word about democracy. And he just thought, if there's something I can do to make sure that these folks have an election that's clean, I'm going to do it. And he did.
He was fascinating in many ways. He's only one of, I don't know, two, three Canadians having been an MP in three different provinces, in Quebec and Ontario and BC. But I take it, he considered himself more of a Westerner than anything else, and maybe even a Northwesterner because he had a real passion for Northern Canada.
That is a really important observation. Yes, it's interesting. He's born in England. Most
Mm.
people don't know that. He's born in England. His father, he never knew his dad. His dad died when he was 2. His dad died from a botched operation, and his mother also lost a child. So she just thought, after losing a husband and a child, a brand new baby, she thought, single mother, 2 kids, I'm going to start all over again. I can't stay here in England. She moved back to her home, which was Rosslyn, British Columbia, and that's where John Turner grew up. So he very much was a product of the West. And as you point out, when he was parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Northern Affairs, he spent a great deal of time in the far north of this country, so much so that he took his family in the 70s on canoe trips. This is before cell phones. This is, the kids talk about it nowadays as if anybody got in trouble, we were dead. I mean, there was nobody around for hundreds of miles. And they would go up north on these incredible canoe trips to places that only Indigenous Canadians had ever seen before. But they were amazing trips, and they felt they were the better for them.
And the interesting thing is, if you ask the average person, when you think of canoeing and you think of prime ministers, who do you think of? It's Pierre Trudeau in his
You
buckskin
think of
coat,
Trudeau.
right?
Yep. But you should think of Turner as well, because he did as much, if not more, canoeing, and certainly in more places than Pierre Trudeau did.
And here's a guy who got into politics in his 30s. He's a stunningly good-looking guy. Around the same time when John F. Kennedy entered the big picture, and there were a lot of comparisons. It's kind of like, well, he's kind of like Canada's Kennedy, I guess some would say, right?
Absolutely right.
He's appointed as finance minister by Prime Minister Trudeau, the first one, Pierre. Notice I didn't say the only one, because there could be one more after this. Who knows? But he quits in 1975 because he quits in protest over the price and wage controls. Not a lot of people do that.
No, he had promised, or his very firm position was, I guess I should set the scene here. It's funny. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Inflation was out of control back then. We think it's bad today at whatever it is, 7 or 8. I think it was 11, 12 back then. So really tough inflationary times, big budget deficits. He's the Minister of Finance. And despite the fact that things were problematic, he had a really good reputation as a guy who gave Canadians the impression that he had the steady hand on the tiller. But Pierre Trudeau was getting a lot of pressure to bring in wage and price controls, and Mr. Turner didn't want to do it. He just thought it wasn't the right solution. And I guess at some point, push came to shove. The two of them actually got on well. They had a good professional relationship, not as close personally as I think either one of them would have liked, but a good professional relationship. But eventually, I think the 10th of September, 1975, they have this private meeting, one-on-one, at 24 Sussex. There were only 2 people in the room, and Ted, they're both dead, so we're never going to know for sure what happened there. But suffice it to say, it fell apart. Mr. Turner left the meeting, announced his resignation, and after he left, Mr. Trudeau brought in those wage and price controls anyway that he had so ridiculed. Remember what he said? Remember what he said when Robert Stanfield, the Conservative leader, said bring in wage and price controls? What did Trudeau say?
I don't remember the exact words, but not very favorable.
He said, "What am I gonna do? I'm gonna look at prices and say, zap, you're frozen." And the Liberal backbench loved it. They lapped it up and they laughed and they applauded. And then, of course, as soon as Turner left, that's exactly what Mr. Trudeau did. So,
and Turner went on to a very, very successful career on Bay Street and sat on many boards of directors and probably made a whole whack of money, I would guess.
Definitely. He was the most desired corporate director in the country at that time. And he probably sat on, 16 different boards of directors, and they were all, big ones, Fortune 500 companies. And yes, he was ensconced in one of those gold Royal Bank towers down by the waterfront in the heart of the financial district at a law firm called Macmillan Binch. It's still around today. It's just called Macmillan LLP today. But that's where he was, and that's where he stayed for a decade until that famous walk in the snow by Pierre Trudeau in 1984. And then people across the country in the Liberal Party said, "John, you got to come back into public life and save this party. You're the only one who can do it."
But who were the main characters in the party who wanted him to come back?
Well, if you remember back to the 68 convention, which Pierre Trudeau won, and in which John Turner came third, and he was only in his late 30s at the time. It was too soon for him, Everybody said, you're really running for next time, right? And he said, "No, I'm running for this time. I'm not running for some future convention in 1984. I'm running for now." And how crazy is that it actually was in 1984 that he ended up running again. But there was a group, he hung on there till the second last ballot, and there was a group of 195 who knew he wasn't going to win but voted for him anyway. So this so-called Club of 195, as they became known, were the people who were sort of keeping an eye on things while he was in the private sector, constantly touching base with him. What do you think, John? Is it time to come back? Is it time to come back? And, Lloyd Axworthy, Irwin Cotler, Christy Clark's father, who was in British Columbia, he was one. John DeB Payne was another guy. John Swift. These were all people, names that may not mean much today, but these were all Torrance Wiley. You know, they were wheelers and dealers in politics. Rick Alway was another one, the Hart House warden. Jerry Grafstein, who went to the Senate eventually. These were people who were constantly reminding him, you know, Trudeau's not going to be there forever. And when he leaves, that's our moment. And when Mr. Trudeau left, that was their moment. And they didn't count on one thing, though, Ted. They didn't count on John Turner being just really rusty, not tournament tough. And by the time he came back into public life, after being in the private sector for 10 years, he just was not the same golden boy that he'd been in the 60s and 70s.
You think in retrospect, you would look back and say, I shouldn't have done this? I do regret that move?
Nope, absolutely not. He never regretted it, even though, I tell you this, it cost him millions of dollars. Had he stayed in the private sector and not come back, I mean, this is a guy who probably took an 85% pay cut to come back into public life.
Yeah.
So he could have stayed in the private sector, making his millions, enjoying his life. But he always believed, this was his great line, democracy doesn't happen by accident. You've got to participate. That's what he always said.
Yeah.
And he just believed that people, if they could, if they had talent, and he had talent, that if they could contribute something to the country, they must. And so when his party called, he answered the call, even though he knew that the Liberals had been in for a long time and he probably was going to lose that first election. But he did it because he thought it was necessary.
Yeah. The book is called John Turner, An Intimate Biography of Canada's 17th Prime Minister. The author is Steve Paikin, who, of course, is host of TVO's The Agenda. Steve, I can't thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us. It's always fascinating to chat with you, and I hope we can do it again soon. So pull out your typewriter and start writing about somebody else. And we know it ain't going to be Doug Ford because he's not going to respond.
Oh, hope springs eternal. Come on, Mr. Ford. Come on, the agenda. I know you'll have a good time.
I hope he does too. I hope he does. Steve, thanks very much.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. I always enjoy your company. We have the greatest conversations, and I'm grateful for your time. Thank you.
We do, and good luck to your Ticats and to a certain degree your Red Sox.
Oski wee wee, baby. Oski wee wee.
All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Ted.
Thank you. And thanks once again to all for listening. And if you do get a chance, click on the follow button and the podcast will always be there for you. And also, if you get a chance, go online and fill out your organ and tissue donation card. You could change or even save a life. Have a great week.
The Ted Wallachin Podcast has been brought to you by Halenda's, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortino's, and Foodland locations. Halenda's, the way sausage should taste. And Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. The Ted Wallachin Podcast is produced by Joey Roselli. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. I'm Becky Coles. Submit your questions and comments to ted@twmedia.ca.